Hello everyone and welcome to the Game Asset Creation Week 8 lecture. In preparing this week's lecture, I had a look at the content from last year. The lecture went for about 10 minutes and half of that we'd covered already. So to quickly recap what was in there, they looked a little bit at lighting in Unreal. We will get to that. I figure I'd roll that content into another lecture as we get a bit closer to assignment 2 being due. And for this week, I thought it would be more worthwhile to cover a bit more of the high-resolution modeling techniques and some of the modifiers so that you can make use of that on your high-res model for assignment 2, which you should be well into at this point. So a quick recap of the high-res modeling itself. So we've got our basic cube, the modifiers properties panel is the little blue spanner. If we do add modifier subdivision surface, one quad becomes 4. If we up it another level, one quad becomes 16 and so on. We can then go into this mesh. Something I may or may not have covered particularly well is the face smoothing. So within face, we can either do shade flat or shade smooth. This will work on individual faces, so that's where your sort of smoothing group stuff comes from. For your high-res mesh, what you'll probably most likely want to do is shade everything smooth, and then add in any creases by actual, increase in the geometry. So whether that's adding in extra edge loops to get that sharper edge on the side there, or by selecting edges, and then right click edge crease will bring that sharper. Again, that will sort of depend on how many layers of subdivision surface as how well that crease sort of comes up. I tend to find that the adding of extra edge loops gives a sharper crease with less subdivision modeling levels. So I mean, if that was brought back to 2, so 2 or 3 is pretty standard. We can see that whilst this crease is sharpening the mesh to a certain point, because of the smoothing groups and the amount of polys, we're not necessarily getting that edge there. Something else that can help with that kind of a crease on that sort of shape is if you were to go down to the object data properties, so the green triangle, expand the normals tab and do auto smooth. This will give you an angle-based cutoff. So anything that's 30 degrees or sharper, Blender will assign a hard edge to that. If I was to drop that down to 15, that starts to get some harder edges there. Being an automated thing, this will do mathematically what it's told to do, but artistically might not grab all the edges that you're after. So it can be handy, but usually better to define those edges yourself. So I mean, if we were wanting that one to be sharp, at any point you can apply the subdivision modifier and get the actual high-res mesh back out of it. So if we were to select that edge, right click, at this point we could do a bevel, which would give us the 2 edge loops down there. Or if we expand this out, and again it's overlapping with screencast keys, sorry, there's not much I can do about that, expand that to 2 segments, that'll give us our 3 lines down there. We can adjust how exactly sort of sharp that is by typing in numerically there. So 0.005 will obviously give a very sort of sharp edge, so you can also go about it that way. So next one I want to cover is the decimate modifier. This one will be easier to show if I add subdivision surface. So if we keep an eye on our poly count here, at the moment this isn't too bad. It's, for the shape it's quite high. 2,500 tries. So let's just say we've been working on our model for a while. Just going to add some extra detail here to show the process a bit better. and we'll have a couple of flatter shapes coming out as well, because that'll help show this. And just deliberately cut a whole ton of edge loops in there. Okay, so we've got our absolute masterpiece of 3D design. Got plenty of triangles, plenty of quads. We'll just bump that up to 3. So now we've got 160 odd thousand triangles. Let's say, for example, we had quite a number of these shapes going on, and they were all slightly different. Our poly count is getting close to 500,000 polys. Maybe you've got a laptop or a bit of an older machine. It's entirely possible that with your high-res mesh, at some point you'll start to get your scene slowing down. So there is a way to, and that was just for example, there is a way to take a high-res mesh and keep most of the surface details, but remove a whole bunch of the polygons. And for those who aren't familiar with it, that process is called decimate. So if we were to apply this, each of those faces would become an actual face. You can see we've got far too many edge loops through here. And there is a lot we can do to simplify this shape, or at least the computer could do for us to simplify this shape. So if we were to have our mesh selected, add modifier, decimate, immediately this doesn't do anything. However, of the 3 options here, the one you usually want is collapse, which is the default. What we can do is say, I want there to be 0.1 or 10% of the polygons that there used to be. So we type that in, we'll see that our shape is pretty much the same, but if we were to look at in wireframe mode, you'll see that Blender has removed a whole lot of the edge loops on areas that are flat and kept as many triangles or quads as possible on areas that are smooth. So it's doing its best to keep the shape that you had before and remove polygons where they aren't making much of a difference. So depending on how dense your mesh is, you can kind of use this as a slider, but word of advice, it's much easier to type in and let Blender calculate it once. If you drag it as a slider, Blender is going to try and calculate it at each frame, which just inherently takes a while. So we can pretty accurately halve the amount of polys in our model, or 0.02 will give us 2% of the polys that we had. If we go back to solid, you'll see that it's kept most of that shape. Some of the smoothing groups are smoothing is starting to get a little weird on the edges, but this is a very, very handy modifier for keeping most of the detail in a shape but reducing a whole lot of the poly count. Do not use this process to make your low poly models. It's not going to give you clean models. It's the models that it makes are going to have, just go back into wireframe mode, triangles going everywhere, triangles of different width and size. UV unwrapping this is going to be a royal pain. So it's still best to make your low-res mesh by having the high-res mesh and tracing the low-res over the top of it. So that is the retopology stuff that we've had a look at before, where you can set the snapping tool to face, set that to project individual elements, and it'll help to turn X-ray on, which I believe is viewport display in front. Used to be called X-ray mode, but anyway. If we add a different material and just make this a different color, this is still the preferred way to make your low-res mesh. So you've got your high-res mesh underneath it, and you start tracing the low-res polys over the top of it. This will give you a much cleaner result. The UV unwrapping will be much easier to do. Assigning different materials to different faces will be much easier to do, although we'll be doing most of that with the texture-based stuff that we've had a look at. But anyway, I digress. Back to the decimate modifier. Like any modifier, it'll just remain sitting on top of your mesh until you click apply. So if you were to go back into edit mode, all that high res detail is still there. It's just when you tab back out into object mode, it'll be showing less detail in the viewport. For assignment 2, with your high res mesh, please make sure you've got at least one mesh still with the subdivision modifier applied. Just undo a bunch and see if I can get back to that point. Probably not. Blender has a fair bit of undo, but not unlimited. I think it's capped to 64 by default. Undo steps. Anyway, so please make sure you've still got at least one mesh in your high-res mesh when you sort of supply your assignment 2 deliverables that has the high-res edge loops, the edge crease, the subdivision modifier still on, just to help me marking. But if you've got a whole range of different objects that are sort of different components and you need to use that decimate to get some of them down, just so that your machine can handle the end result, I don't mind you using decimate on some of the parts. I just need to see at least one part of the object that still has all those cleaner edge loops on it. Instancing. So this one I've shown briefly. You may or may not need this as part of your assignment. It depends on what sort of object you're doing. But let's say you had an object that had a whole lot of bolts or press studs or like little components that are going to be repeated a lot over your mesh. So let's just say we've got our UV sphere. We've selected a few different parts of it. E for extrude, S to scale in. So we've got this little shape here. Scale that down and we start placing that along our model. So it might be that there's a little component there. Shift D to duplicate. We'll make another one. Shift D to duplicate. Make another one, and we'll put a fourth one there just to show what's going on. So at the moment, all of these are individual objects. So if we were to grab that poly and move it out, go back into object mode, it's its own thing. Where instancing comes in handy is if you've got a whole lot of little objects like this. If you were to do shift, select 1, 2, 3, 4, again, the active object is the most recent one. So if we were to make this the sort of the master object here, so that is the brighter color orange. If we were to do Control L, that will say what do you want to link. So we can link what materials are on it, animation data, we're not going to have any of that. You can link modifiers, so one object will have a range of objects will all have the same modifier and you can edit them all at once sort of thing. For this example, we're going to make an instance of the object data. So that one has snapped back to being the same detail as what's going on in the rest of them. If we were to select any of these meshes, we edit one, we edit all of them. So it'll only work on the object you've got actively selected, but if I was to deselect this one, select this one, make the changes on this one here, those changes will be matched on all of the other objects. So not necessarily a modifier as such, but could be very, very handy if you're making an object for assignment 2 that has a lot of little repeated components. So there is another way that we can make use of instancing, and that is to have a child mesh parented to a parent mesh, and then the child mesh will be duplicated on each vertice of the parent. So it sounds a little complex, but not too bad, as I'll sort of show now. So we've got our 2 rings of vertices. This will be our parent mesh. If I was to add another mesh, just a little UV sphere, and shift select this one, we can right click on any of these and do copy all to selected. So that has got our child mesh in the same location exactly as the parent one. Shift select, so the brighter orange is the active. Control P, make parent. So immediately this hasn't done anything, but if we were to take our parent object here, and on the object properties panel, so this orange square, instancing, so if we were to change that to verts, we'll now see that each vertice on our parent mesh has now spawned one of these. So again, this can be useful for a range of different sort of modeling techniques. Could be the start of getting chainmail to line up in place for a particular character. You might be able to take this parent mesh and scale it down, and use the retopology stuff that we've looked at before. If that is set to face and project individual elements. Not a great example, my apologies. I don't know why that's not. Okay, so what was happening in that example there is project onto self was turned on, and that was causing some issues. But now that we've got this here, can scale this down a bit so we see what's going on better. If we were to take the individual verts, or with the soft selection or proportional editing tool, we can then start to have this lower res mesh sort of basically hug the surface of the higher res mesh. Smooth that out a bit. And yeah, on each of these verts here, we'll spawn one of the smaller ones. So that doesn't look super useful as it is, so I'll just delete most of what's going on there, and just extrude out. So select every other vert, delete those, so we've got our two verts here. Go back into solid mode. So now we can trace that lower res mesh on top, and we've got all of our instance components on the top there. So not the cleanest example I've done so far, but yeah, if you wanted to use that as a way to place bolts, rivets, chainmail, any sort of repeated detail on a surface, that is sort of the way you could go about it. That can also be changed to whether you want one to show up in the middle of each face, but verts is generally the more useful way of doing it. So we'll just delete a couple of these things before carrying on, clean up the scene a bit. Right, so displacement. I've shown this as an example, particularly using displacement as an image texture. Displacement can also come in handy for just adding some procedural noise to roughen up the surface of an object. So if we were to right click, subdivide, bring up our menu here, because displacement needs a lot of polys to work. That seems to be maxed at 10 for some reason, but let's do right click, subdivide, bring that up to 10 again. So what we've got now is one plane with 24,000 tries ish. So if we were to add a modifier, displacement, or displace, add a new texture. At the moment this has uniformly punched it all back down. So for now we put that to 0.1, and add a procedural noise texture. So it's defaulting to image or movie and waiting for you to assign one. But if we do clouds, this gives us a procedural noise that we can scale up. We can say how detailed is it. Just add a bit more subdivision to that. So now we've got close to 400,000 sort of tries. We can change the scale of this, the detail as mentioned. There are a range of different sort of noise patterns that you can try. So this can be a way of getting like the basics of like a rock sort of surface. Might help for creating like a temporary sort of a terrain mesh. There are sort of a range of uses that displacement can have for the high-res modeling. Also, if you were to go to the texture on the colors, it's currently clamped. If you turn clamp off, it'll allow pixels that are brighter than 100% white and pixels that are darker than 100% black. So just to emphasize that a bit, if I was to turn up the contrast a lot, with clamp turned off, that's going to create very nice sort of peaks and valleys. With clamp turned on, that is going to knock things back so nothing is brighter than white, or as far as white that the monitor is displaying, and nothing is darker than black. So if we were to go back the other direction, we'll see that that is clamped as the darkest bit punching back in, and clamped as the brightest bit punching up. So this type of noise stuff, for the high-res modeling, you wouldn't really want to use it on your low-res mesh, but it can very quickly create some procedural surface detail for you. This is also influenced by the vertex group, which we sort of had a look at before. But let's just say we had our texture unclamped, so we're getting noise everywhere. We'll turn the strength of it back down in the modifier here. Whoop. 0.02, so that's giving us some nice sort of noise there. We'll turn clamp back on. It's going to be easier to show this with clamp turned off. So vertex groups. So if we were to go to our green triangle, so for the object data properties, add a vertex group and have this as displacement group. That hasn't immediately done anything, but if we change that to displacement group, everything is currently set to 0 because no vertices are assigned to that group. If we were to go to vertex paint, nope, that's the colored one, weight paint. So weight paint will let you paint directly onto your mesh because we have displacement group selected. If I was to go back to object mode, we'll see that we've got displacement only where we painted. So this can come very, very much in handy if we've got, so the group set up here, we can invert how that group is controlling the displacement. So it might be that we want noise on everything and we just want the outer edges where things have been, you know, slamming up against each other or being worn down or being used. We can then go back to our weight paint, paint along the edges. How responsive this is sort of depends on how dense your mesh is. So I'm getting a bit of slowdown here. Can change the brush size with F. Painting our edges as being clean here, and maybe that sort of feathers in that way. So if we go back to object mode, we'll see that we've got our noisier parts and our smoother parts, and we can adjust the strength of that to get a whole lot of different effects. So yeah, can be very, very helpful for blocking in like the basic idea of a terrain mesh, or you know, if you had a mini map or you wanted to do you know, just some procedural noise that sort of dents up an object or makes it look more natural or organic. Displacement can come in handy for a range of uses. By its nature, of course, this is very, very high poly, so once you've done what you need to do with your displacement, this would probably be a case where you wanted to apply your decimate on top of that. Of to reduce how many polys there are, keep the shape, wait for that to apply, and then you would be able to use this to do your texture baking onto the low-res mesh. So, moving right along, next one I wanted to have a look at was the simple deform. So I'll just make a bit of a shape to show that off. Work of art. So if this shape was repeated a lot along the y-axis, so we've modeled that a few times, maybe we've beveled it as well. So we've got our shape that we're going to be making adjustments to. If we go into object mode, which is of course where all modifiers are generally applied, simple deform. So this gives us a few options. I find that it always tends to pick the axis that you never wanted to use. So you can manually set this as to which axis it's working on. I find that in terms of controlling this, if we were to do Shift A to add an empty object, plain axes. So we've got our little empty object here. Our empty object is named empty. We can name that to something a bit more useful, like bend empty. And if we set our axis origin to that empty object, we can now move effectively where the pivot of that deform is happening. So we've got a couple of different options here. If we were to set this to 360, that would twist our entire object around the axis. Might be preferable to do that on a different axis. Something you'll notice very obviously with this mesh, the smoother the mesh is, the nicer the twisting will be. So, I mean, if this was part of a robotic DNA chain or something, that might be alright. But it may be that you need to have a subdivision surface modifier and move that above in the chain. So that is now smoothed out our curves. Again, with a modifier sort of a stack, anything that's at the top will be processed first, and then each modifier will be applied one after the other going down that stack there. So now if we did, 1080, that would do 3 twists of our object. If we were to turn the subdivision off, there's not enough polys to make that work nicely. But if we were to do that with subdivision on, so there's plenty of polys going on, you can very easily start to get some complex shapes going. And of course, because that pivot point is set to the empty, we can move this around, rotate it, and get all sorts of shapes happening that you could model by hand, but this modifier just allows for a lot more sort of experimentation or doing it cleaner, or a range of options through that. As well as the twist, there is the bend modifier. So if I was to move that along, so also turn that off of being 1080 because that's far too high. So, there's 360 degrees in a full rotation, so 180 will give you half. We've also got other options of taper, which will taper the object down from largest to smallest, and one more to round it out is stretch. So that is doing the effect that you sort of see there. And that's more of a factor than a 360 degrees around, because that's what makes more sense for this object. So that is the simple deform modifier for that one there. Next one to take a look at, which we've had a brief look at before, is the Boolean modifier. So this is generally seen as being the cheap and nasty way to model. Please don't rely on just booleans to get your shape made. But, you know, from time to time it does have its uses. So just to show that one off again, if we were to add boolean on the object that we want to do, cut in of or add to, or, you know, we then select our second object, either with the drop down menu, or if that was cleared, we can use the object picker within the scene. If this is set to difference, so we hide our object, that has taken one object, it has taken the second object that we picked, and it is the difference between the two is what we're left with. So that is what the Boolean modifier is doing there. If we were to set this to union, it would give us the outer shell of both. And if we were to set this to intersect, it would give us, this is the resulting mesh of where those two intersect. So again, it can be useful. Why I referred to it as being cheap and nasty is it'll often leave you with a whole lot of triangles that can produce, you know, triangles or n-gons, or just things that may affect your shading when you're trying to bake from one to the other. So, I mean, a quicker way to sort of help those edges along there might be to turn on the auto smooth. That has helped, but generally speaking, you'll get a cleaner result if you were to model the actual shape you're wanting, all through extrudes and sort of the more traditional subdivision modeling stuff. But if you need to use a Boolean or two here and there to get things done, that's okay. So we'll just go backwards, turn that off, unhide all, don't need this anymore. Solidify. So if I was to add a single plane, we could continue on this model, extrude, follow around till we get sort of the shape that we're after. This mesh has no thickness. If we wanted to quickly add some thickness to that shape, because it's only one plane with no sort of, I mean, it's rendering back faces, but there is no actual physical thickness to this object. If we were to do add modifier solidify, so that has shown up real thin because it's defaulting to 0.01 of a meter. If we were to set that to 0.15, just so it shows up a bit easier, we can continue modeling, and Blender will just uniformly add thickness to our mesh for us. So where this might come in handy is if you'd modeled like a coffee mug or something. So if we were to do add mesh cylinder, delete that top face, move that over here, so our coffee mug has no thickness to it. If we were to do add modifier solidify, bring that in, apply, we now have some physical depth to that object. So yes, pretty simple one to explain, very handy one to use. Yeah, where solidify can have issues is when you start to get really thin faces. If I was to add in a loop here, so when it gets to this corner and this edge, solidify is starting to freak out a bit. So if that was moved back into the center, everything's still a bit more uniform. It handles things fine, but just keep an eye on it. If you've got edges that are real close to each other, solidify can start to go real wonky there. You can try and play around with the clamp settings, but then you sort of tend to lose your uniform thickness. So it's not, you know, if we were to turn the clamp back off, it's not getting these extra weird polys show up, but at the trade-off of we're not getting any thickness there. Of course, once we've got this more or less how we like it, we can apply and then go in and make tweaks ourselves to bring that back to the shape that we want. So yes, solidify, pretty straightforward, very handy. Next modifier. So, the smooth modifier. If I was to apply that, add smooth under deform, so about 2/3 of the way down. This is handy in some cases, but it is not a fix all my problems with my mesh modifier. So factor is how smooth that is. Generally you want to keep that between 0 and 1, otherwise it starts doing real weird things. 0.5 is fine. Repeat, or just repeat the smoothing. So generally speaking, once you get to a factor that is 1 or less, you'll want to increase this rather than increase this, because as we saw, if that's 1 but the factor is too much, what that's doing is it's smoothing it as smooth as it can, but then it's moving these vertices past where they were, so it ends up not being smooth at all. So the general idea is to keep that between 0 and 1, add a repeat here, and that will start to smooth out our mesh. This will also not care about any details we've added to our mesh. So if we've got most of this mesh here, we want some of it smooth, but we've got some really intricate bits that we definitely want to keep. Smoothing is just going to smooth all of it. This can be another modifier that works real nice with vertex groups. So if we were to go to object properties, object data properties, green triangle, add a vertex group, smooth. Now you can either, in wireframe mode, to make sure you grab the back ones, select a few individual ones and assign them to that vertex group. Or we can do the object mode weight paint option that we sort of used before on our other mesh. Go back into object mode, solid shaded mode. We can now assign a vertex group to that smoothing or reverse it, so that the smoothing is only affecting verts that are part of that group or verts that are not part of that group. So smooth can be useful. Again, it's not going to necessarily fix all bad topology. If you've got triangles going everywhere, it's going to try and uniformly smooth them out, but the cleaner the mesh, the less you need to rely on stuff like this to try and fix it. I did see that a few times on assignment 1. Anyway, it has its uses as a modifier, but don't rely just on this modifier to get smoother meshes. Anyway, and the last one that I wanted to have a look at, again, we'll just clean up a few of our objects, is the shrink wrap modifier. So if I was to add mesh plane, move that roughly into place over here, and subdivide a few times to get a few polys, and we'll just add a new material. This isn't part of it, but it'll just help things show up a little easier. Add modifier, shrink wrap. So halfway down on the deform. This won't do anything immediately. It needs a target to act on. So either from the drop-down menu or the color picker. So as the name sort of implies, it's going to try and take one mesh and shrink wrap it over the top of anything it can find underneath it. So this will also kind of act smoother depending on how many polys are in your mesh as to how smoothly it shrink wraps to it. Nearest surface point project, it can specifically project in the positive or negative value. Project is going to give you the cleanest result I've found. So there's a couple of different modes. It defaults to nearest surface point, but if you have this on project, you can now have that mesh project onto the mesh underneath it. So this is pretty much the same as what we were doing earlier with the snap, snap to face. However, because this is a modifier, this can be turned on or off, and we can keep our original shape. So if we, again, it's going to be very dependent on the topology underneath it. If you have triangles that are sort of overlapping each other, this modifier will start to freak out. But it may be that we were wanting to set that to increment, turned off. Have some sort of smoother curves going that way. We can then, so let's say we've got this line here and we wanted to extrude that out. That's going to get real messy, but just bear with me a second. Vertex groups again. So if we were to go to our green triangle down here, add a new vertex group, shrink, wrap, and Control I, invert our selection, assign most of it to shrink wrap. We can continue modeling on this part of the mesh here. It'll stay nice and outwards, but anything on that modifier will be shrink wrapped to the shape of that other mesh underneath. So where this might come in handy is if you were to model one object that needed to transition into another, or look like it was softly resting on top of something. You know, maybe this underneath here is the ground mesh and you are starting to model out some tree roots or something. So yeah, shrink wrap can have its uses. It's not the most useful of the one we've looked at so far today, but yeah, it can come in handy for certain sort of use cases. So if we were to unhide that there, yeah. If it was to have a solidify on top of that, and we can adjust the thickness of that. Offset, so I failed to mention offset before. This is, I mean, whether it's taking the front faces or the back faces to add thickness to. So now we've got our one object that looks like it's stuck onto the top of another. Yeah, could be also a good starting for, say, clothing. So if you needed to model a sleeve that looked like it's sitting over the top of a character's arm and it needs to hug the surface, and then become its own mesh for, say, the collar, where the collar of the shirt is sticking out more. So that's a brief overview of some of the handier modifiers, particularly with assignment 2 in mind. Obviously, there are a range of modifiers in here that we didn't get to covering. Feel free to experiment with any of those, but the ones I've shown are the ones that I would tend to use in modeling, especially for the high-res modeling sort of pass. For the low-res, again, I need to emphasize, make sure you model that poly by poly using the retopology method, because you'll get a much cleaner mesh that way. But in order to generate whatever detail you need for the high-res mesh, feel free to use as many of these modifiers as you like, different combinations of them, and whatever gives you the end resulting shape that you need. Thank you very much.